everybody. Welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyseller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website at Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, June 11th at 11:30 a.m., featuring Gary Goodman and his book, The Last Bookseller, A Life in the Rare Book Trade. This month's speaker is Amy Sullivan, who will talk about her book, Opioid Reckoning, Love, Loss, and Redemption in the Rehab State. Minnesota's alcohol and drug rehabilitation programs have long been held up as the gold standard. But when it comes to addressing the opioid crisis, Dr. Sullivan says that the Minnesota model has fallen short. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. Now let's welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, Amy Sullivan. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here and look forward to chatting with you about my book. I thought for our time today that I would share a few slides with you to talk a little bit about some of the main themes in the book and the things that I discovered, and also why I started writing this book and how it all came to be. So I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me here. Okay. So, there we go. Some of you may know that there's a long history in Minnesota about sobriety and Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm going to talk to you about some of that later on, but I just wanted you to see a New York Times Sunday feature story from 1995 called Greetings from Minnesota. Take a tour of the Gopher State, the land of recovery, home of the inner child, capital of the codependent. This was news to me when I first started my project, that the treatment centers had originated, drug treatment centers had originated in Minnesota. It's one of many things I learned. So what I'm gonna do is talk a little bit about that and how we move along. I'm a professor at Macalester College. I teach history there, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So we are currently in the third wave of the opioid epidemic. It's shocking to me that something that started in 1999 has yet to be quelled. In fact, it's only gotten worse. As of 2019, nearly 500,000 people had died from an opioid overdose. That number is approaching 1 million at this point. It's probably up around 850,000 people. And what started was the prescription overdose deaths, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Prescriptions, opioids, and how those came to be misused and abused, and now fake ones have entered the illicit market. The 2010 kind of changed things. 2010 changed things for us in terms of heroin becoming more prolific. It was coming in from Mexico, black tar heroin. It was really easy to hide. It was coming in from Afghanistan, and it just the clampdown on prescription drugs led to an increase in heroin trafficking. In 2013, fentanyl, the substance that's 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin, and prescription opioids, in fact, really entered the the market, and his coming mostly from China and Mexico. And it again is really hard to detect because it is such a small amount, can cause an overdose death, and therefore something that is so small and concentrated is also easy to hide. One thing I wanted to point out is the fact that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how utterly horrible that has been for many of us, but for people who have a drug addiction, it was often it ended their lives. 108,000 people died in 2021. Death increases at the beginning of COVID saw an increase in 30 to 50%. So these are just staggering numbers, and rather than starting to go down because of all the opioid litigation, they're still going up, and it's kind of boggling to me how this is still happening. But let's go back to 2011, where I didn't know any of this, where I was the mom of two teenage girls, and I experienced an opioid-related family trauma. My oldest daughter had an overdose in my home. We were able to get her to the emergency room. She spent many weeks in the hospital, but she survived, and she's doing beautifully today. I could not have written this book if she was not doing okay. So my heart and my intentions for this project go to parents and families who have suffered a loss or who are currently suffering. So I had an incredible amount of ignorance about addiction. I had, some alcoholism in extended family members, but I didn't understand. And I certainly didn't know about heroin. I thought it was something that rock stars overdosed on. And I was also a product of the DARE program that many of you might know. I was probably I joke that I was probably one of like 20 people that the DARE program actually worked for in my generation in the 70s and 80s. And so I had a lot to learn. I threw myself into this topic. I wrote, I reached out to doctors, to family support groups, and learned what I could. I also started, because I'm a historian, I started studying the history of addiction, of recovery, the history of illicit and licit drugs, and history of medicine was already in my wheelhouse. And then also the history of women and motherhood was in my wheelhouse. I teach women's history, and I teach the history of childhood. So I was very versed in parenting trends and how all these different things intersect. And then one of my favorite tools is oral history. If people ask me, well, what kind of historian are you? I'm an oral historian. I love people's stories. I love narrative history. And as I came to know more about the traditions in 12-step programs and how powerful story and personal stories are in that tradition, I realized there was this really wonderful spot where if I could find people who were willing to engage in a longer history of their lives around this issue about the opioid epidemic, that maybe I could glean some insights, and maybe I could share things with either people today or people in the future by recording and saving those interviews. So these are some of my students in this picture. That's the view from the top picture is the view from my daughter's room at the ICU. For many days we were in there, and that just that picture to me really symbolizes the loneliness that parents and family members face in those spaces. And it is you are so utterly alone. And you're utterly alone for all kinds of reasons, because we stigmatize drug use and we stigmatize addiction. And so when a loved one is in those spaces, there's very rarely like the kind of support that a person would get who was in there for a car accident or something. The picture on the bottom is my some of my students back probably 3 or 4 years ago, who I started training, having someone from the community come and train my students who are in my drugs, addiction, and recovery history class how to use Narcan, how to prevent an overdose, and that's been a really successful program through my class. But then the college has also taken on training people, and I'll share more about that in a minute. Okay. Oops. So like I said, this project is based on oral histories. It is, I conducted 60. I probably did 50. I got some students to interview a few people for me. But these are the numbers, how they kind of shook out. I wanted to get a cross section of people who were directly affected in really deep personal ways in their families, and also people who were social workers, law enforcement, treatment specialists, physicians, and just get this broad swath of people who were working kind of on the ground with people. And about 26 of those 60 end up in the book. These are just some of the lovely people who I was able to interview for my project. Among them were all the people I just mentioned before: parents, physicians, treatment specialists, just a delightful group of people. And I should also say, in the practice of oral history, if listeners aren't familiar with it, we ask the permission of the narrator from the beginning through the end of the process. I'm even more, I go beyond what is asked in oral history standards. I made sure that everyone who was in the book saw where they were mentioned and what I had written about them, and they all gave their permission. And maybe we can talk a little bit about why would people share such deeply personal stories in a book right now, because I think that's a really interesting, it's very healing, but it also begs the question, we need to be talking about this. So some of the big themes that came out of the stories as I listened to them and then read my own transcripts and re-listened, was this common pattern. And I haven't visualized it. I haven't created a visual representation of it yet, but I will. And it comes down to these 4 things. Stigma about drug use thrived on shame, people having shame. And we know that stigma is a good way to keep people in check, right? It's how we keep people behaving, right? We push people out from our societies who are not behaving in the way that we want them to. Stigma has some very, very tiny benefits until it's causing an epidemic, I think. But stigma thrives on the idea of shame, that you feel shame when you've been ostracized. You feel lesser than your peers, your community. And the shame, I found, was really mostly about fear of being exposed or regret at things that people had done when they were under the influence of and unable to get out of their substance use disorder, and just incredible shame about not being able to heal themselves in the ways that people were telling them, well, you should be able to do it this way. Then I noticed, and you all may know this just from your own personal experience, that when we feel fear or we have regret, we often don't share that. We tend to hide that. It creates, we silence some of that, not just in our own selves, but in our society. And this is, as a historian, I'm faced with this nearly every day when I teach. Like, why didn't I know that before? Why didn't we learn our lesson then? This is the silence I'm talking about. And then one thing then to just close this circle, silence keeps stigma intact, because if people don't speak up for the people who are oppressed and in pain and ostracized, then nothing changes. And that silence helps keep that stigma machine going. I'm happy to talk more about this. The other thing I learned as a historian, and I did not know this, but I was more than willing to jump into it so I could write this book. And that is what I mentioned at the beginning. Minnesota is command central, the Vatican, ground zero, whatever you want to call it, for the drug treatment addiction model that is prevalent throughout the entire United States and in many countries. It's based on the 12-step program. It often requires inpatient treatment. It began at Hazelden, Wilmer State Hospital, and Pioneer House. These were 3 organizations in the 40s that came together and started thinking about how could they deal with the problem of the anebs, the inebriates, that things were changing in psychology, and they were like, this is not right. These people should not be with these people in this institution. And lo and behold, it's a whole long story about Bill Wilson and the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it coalesced in Minnesota, this idea of the inpatient treatment model. And it started for doctors and priests and lawyers and other professionals. This was not a model for the common person who was struggling. Women were not even allowed there. And that was a big, huge issue when it first opened. The idea is you spend all that time away from your family. You spend 28 days away from your family in order to clear your head, clear your body of the substance, and start working the program, which was the 12-step program. This could be really, really, really successful, and it was revolutionary. And I want everyone to understand that there are beautiful and incredibly healing things about the 12-step model and the Minnesota model. In the 1960s, we had a heroin outbreak. We had a heroin crisis. I shouldn't say outbreak. We had a heroin crisis on the coasts, and particularly New York. And this was, I shouldn't say the 60s. This was starting in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It was a problem for quite a while. That's another rich history, is the medical model. I could talk about that for an hour, but I'm going to go quickly through it. And what the medical model involves is medicine. And a very smart woman named Marie Neiswander and her husband, Vincent Dole, discovered that if you gave a small amount of methadone to a person who was using heroin erratically, their metabolism would steady. And if they had that dose, they would not crave, they would be able to get back to work, and they could go back into their lives with their families, and it was revolutionary. The problem is that it became stigmatized as something for people in the inner city, and therefore it became stigmatized as something for people of color and poor people and people who couldn't afford to go to the expensive treatment centers. So that's what happens to the medical model right away in the 60s. In the 1980s, you might recall, we had an HIV/AIDS epidemic, and this created a huge, crisis around the world. And something called harm reduction emerges out of England with drug users who were using needles, who were getting HIV. And so community, grassroots, remember when I said the stigmatized? So there are people who work with those stigmatized people to try to keep them alive. And they are harm reduction advocates, harm reduction workers, harm reduction specialists. And if you think about harm reduction broadly, it's like a seatbelt. Like, remember the fights about seatbelts and people didn't want to wear them? It's to reduce harm. And that's the whole point. And so once it was understood that bloodborne illnesses were being transmitted through needles, then we need to stop the illness, and to stop the illness, we need to provide clean syringes. I know this is extremely controversial, but it is really the only way we're going to save people from dying, and we're going to keep our numbers of HIV down. The thing about harm reduction and the thing about the Minnesota model is that they're really both about loving people and taking care of them and meeting them where they are. Harm reduction does it in a much more it does it in a way that's a lot more empowering to the individual. The 12-step program is more moral and involves someone acknowledging a flaw. The medical model says, you're not flawed, you have an illness and we can help you. So when I talk about these three as being siloed, that's what happens. You know, there's the moral model, just stop, don't use anything of any substance ever again. The medical model says, you need just use this medicine and check in with us. And the harm reduction model says, where are you right now and what do you need? And how can I help you stay safe? So those are the three models. And I take time with this, and I'm trying to keep track of my time, but I take time with this because it is really one of the main things that I learned. And it's also one of my main messages as I've been talking about my book, is that we have these three models that we need to integrate. We need to quit thinking that this is a moral problem or a legal problem, and we need to integrate all three of these models. And that is starting to happen. And I believe Minnesota can be a leader in that. So what I want to say just briefly about some of these things, and we can talk about them, is what overall I asked myself, what did my narrator's lived experiences reveal to me about what works and what doesn't? The first thing I noticed, and this is one of the things that is, it's incredible how different changing your language changes your attitude or changes how other people think about something. And so language matters. I do not ever use the word addict as a noun towards another person. I will say addicted, I will say addiction, but I don't say the addict because it's stigmatizing. And it's not about the person, it's about their issue, it's about their problem. We wouldn't call someone the cancer, you know, instead referring to someone we loved. The hard part about addiction is that really difficult behaviors and really dangerous things happen when someone is using chaotically. And it's very, very painful for families, and it's very disruptive and scary. And that I totally understand. But changing our language makes a huge difference in how other people, it diminishes the stigma. People first language is what a lot of social workers say now. A person with addiction. The other thing I learned is that empathy works. Strengthening our empathy muscle around topics that are uncomfortable for us because we don't understand them can really help, and maybe can really help solve this. And maybe because I'm a historian and I'm always having to think about people in the past and why did they do that and what were they thinking and how could that have happened, and trying to find these little places where I can better understand humanity has really I'd say developed, well, I think I already had an empathy muscle going from my family of origin, but I've developed it even more, and I see how it works. And that if you are loving and kind and you're thinking about this person as suffering, you will have more creative ideas about how to help them, and you'll have less judgment. The other thing is really brutal, really simply put, is this idea of stigma killing. Stigma kills. If we are against Narcan training, which is the opioid overdose drug that you can just smack in somebody's arm real quick, whether you've ever done this or not, and they come back to life. If you're against that, if you're against people being, you know, kicked out of treatment, there's so many ways that stigma ends up killing people. And we don't think of it that way. We think of it as that was that person's fault. And that goes back to the idea of the moral failing. So if we just realize, okay, how are we treating people? Are we kicking people out of shelters if they are using some substance? Yes. Are they overdosing in the street and dying because they're alone? Yes. So what are the ways, if we want to save people's lives, we need to quit stigmatizing them. The other thing I think you probably have already gotten from me, just the way I'm talking, is that I think that substance use disorders need to be treated the same way that long-term diseases are treated. Regular checkups, come back for a screen, see how you're doing, make sure you're okay. But taking someone for 28 days, putting them in away from everything, and then throwing them back out in the world when their body is craving a substance. The cravings for opioids are really intense. It's alcohol is more dangerous if you've gotten to that level of alcoholism, but using an opioid again will kill you if you've had that long period of time. One of the things that I've learned over the last few years is that Hazelden now sends people home with Narcan and tells their loved ones how to use it, because Hazelden had many people die of overdose because they weren't using any medications that were available. And one of the people in my story, in my book, who tells his story, was the chief medical officer there. And that's a brilliant, it's an incredible story, because he really was trying to integrate the medical model with the 12-step, because he himself had a drug use problem as a teen. The other simple thing, harm reduction practices save lives. People can't heal if they've died, right? People can't gain recovery if they have died. And I don't say that smiling like I'm happy. I'm saying it smiling like, no kidding, right? Like, do we want people to heal or not? And I really this was probably the hardest part for me, was because I really, the war on drugs, but really reading that history makes me realize this is not a war that is working. It has been going on for too long. We have spent, billions and billions of dollars, and we haven't won. And we've stopped other wars that we're not winning. So I just wish that some of that could be really interrogated a little more in terms of public policy, because it's really what I see and what I learned is that it's a war on people, people who have addiction. And yes, there are dealers, and yes, those kinds of people go to jail. But the war on drugs, in terms of trying to keep them out of the United States, is a total fail. And that we're all losers, and we're all suffering from these policies when we could be investing in other things and make it so that people don't want to use drugs chaotically, right? What else do they have to do? And I think the opioid epidemic has really exposed that, especially if you look at the place where it emerged in the Rust Belt. And then, industrial US in Ohio, Kentucky, and then Appalachia, the southern US where industries and unions left. There's just a lot of social policy issues that have led to addiction. And my hope for this book is that this will spark stories and help people realize that this is a more complicated thing, but it's also a simpler thing to fix. It's more complicated than we knew, but it's easier to care for people once we know. So those are my slides. I hope I didn't speak too quickly.
No. Yeah, there's like so many questions.
Oh,
I'm gonna start with the ones I got in. Somebody, or Gillette actually, asked, how has the changing concept of childhood contributed to drug addiction in young adults? And also, what if we make mental health checkups part of the standard of care and not wait for issues?
Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah. Because there is a lot of stigma when you tell people you're going for therapy or mental health. It's a lot harder to get. A lot of times too, you try to go to a therapist and they want to put you on drugs rather than pay for long-term therapy. Like, here's a pill, go away.
Yep. And that's a symbol of a taxed system that isn't really taking care of people. So, okay, there was a question about childhood, adverse childhood experiences, right? Those are called that's called the ACE score. Relating to, yes, for sure, adverse childhood experiences, trauma in childhood. there's a much higher chance that someone is going to look for things to soothe anxiety and depression. And depending on what the symptom is, that will depend. The drug of choice they will find it. Yes, childhood absolutely is an indicator. So many stories, but it's also not an indicator. So you'll read in my book stories about people who were just your typical normal teenager, and then in college had to have surgery, got the morphine. This is a doctor in my book, had morphine injection and was like, oh my gosh, I want more of that, and became addicted to opioids, and then became addicted to fentanyl. So there's not, just because you have a good childhood doesn't mean you're not going to have a substance use issue. And just because you have a bad childhood doesn't mean you're going to have a substance use. So it's complicated, but I really appreciate the question. There's a fantastic author and medical doctor named Gabor Mate, and he wrote the book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. If somebody wants to put that in the chat, or I can in a minute. And that's an incredible book about trauma and childhood, and what wounded people seeking out things that will help them not feel wounded. But on that same thing that you were saying, Shelley, if we talk to children about their mental health from the beginning, and we did it at home, and we did it at school, and we did it in the doctor's office, it would become a normal thing, and it would not be so shame-based. And we might even teach kids tools about how to self-soothe rather than with substances.
Some of what you were talking about with like stigma and all the different helping kind of reminded me of this book I had just been reading called There Are No Accidents. And she dealt with this chapter on accidental overdoses and talked about how things like race and class, judgment, morality, and even like the government makes it hard for people to get was it Narcan? The drugs, like in methadone, that it's really hard. Like methadone clinics are very far apart. So, if you're an addict living in an inner city, how are you going to travel 3 hours to get methadone when you can get like heroin right there? And they don't want to make the other stuff available because they're like, that'll just encourage people to use drugs. It's like, I don't think they need the availability of a life-saving medicine as encouragement, but it's just the whole thing. It almost feels like, oh, well, if you're on drugs and you die, oh, well, you are a worthless person anyway. So we don't care is like ultimately what it comes to.
That's the really harsh and kind of nasty way to look at it. But yes, I think that I think that I have seen and heard that, not from any of my narrators, but people have certainly experienced that. Like, why would I care? I'll give you an interesting example about empathy. And this is just my personal experience. I never gave money to people who were standing at intersections in the cities where I lived. And then when my child became one of those people, I didn't know where she was or who was taking care of, who was keeping an eye on her. I started thinking really differently about those people. I started realizing that's someone's daughter, that's someone's son, and what it would take to stand somewhere and be so willing to be judged and vulnerable. And then I thought, well, I shouldn't give them money because then they're just going to use it on drugs. And then I thought, no, that's not my decision. Like so I had this real interesting moral kind of back and forth over time. And now and then I went to visit a dear friend, college friend in Mexico City, who's Mexican. This is many years ago. And there's people all over the place wanting to clean your windows and do all this stuff for you. And she would always just give them money. She just kept this pile of change. And I started reaching at one point, and she goes, no, 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 no. These people are not your problem. These are our problem. This is because we're not taking care of our people. And that just shifted all kinds of things for me. And I thought, you know what, if I keep some dollar bills in my car and I'm somewhere where I can reach that person, I'm doing it, because it makes me, it helps keep me empathetic, and it helps keep me connected to fellow human beings. I've also handed out Narcan. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I know people who hand out water, or, and you see all those weird piles of snacks and stuff that people get. But really, for me, that was empathy. That was an example of like, what's the hardest thing for me to be okay with in terms of thinking about another human being as a human being, right? Like, what would be that hard? And that was really probably my hardest. And I'm not advocating this for people. I just say, for me, it was because of something I had experienced that then changed my worldview.
Yeah. Yeah. I always looked at it as when people say, oh, I'm not going to give that person on the street money, they'll just buy alcohol. I'm thinking, yeah, we're going out to the bar and we're drinking. But we're going to judge him when he's sleeping in a box in an alley. He needs the drink more than I do. I got a bed to go home to.
Well, we're on the same page then.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, it seems like class too plays, like class, gender, and race all like go into how people talk about, like, when white wealthy people started getting addicted to opiates prescribed by their doctors, there was more sympathy for this issue than when it was people of color or poor people on the streets having similar issues. It's become, you have a war against them, but you have empathy and treat.
Exactly. And the other thing, I don't mean to interrupt you. The other thing I think is really powerful about this epidemic too is that it has hit rural communities with a vengeance. Methamphetamine and heroin and opioid pain pills have hit rural communities. And there's so much class involved in that. There's so much like access to jobs, resources that are wrapped up in that. And I think there's so much isolation that happens as a result. I mean, not far from you all in the White Earth Nation, they've experienced an opioid epidemic that is 8 times what the state of Minnesota has experienced. The number of people dying is 8 times the number. So if you just looked at White Earth, it would stand out as one of its own per capita. It would stand out as among the highest places in the United States. The incredible thing about that community, however, is that they decided in 2011 that they had this problem and they were going to solve it, and they were going to figure out how to do it. And they have really worked so hard, and they have these incredible programs now. And they really stood out to me as a model for how can we think about this in terms of a community problem, community issues. I met someone through the Oral History Association who works in a small town in Kentucky. She's an artist, and her town took up the idea of this psychologist who'd worked in Iceland, who said, our kids are drinking too much. This community in Iceland was like, our kids are drinking too much. They don't have anything to do. These teenagers are drunk all the time. So they created these like cards, and that were like vouchers for sports, art, dance lessons, anything that could happen in the community. Well, this Kentucky community took that on, and now they have a place where their 12-year-olds, their 10-year-olds can get connected to adults in the community, can learn skills after school. And it's not about don't do drugs. It's about, hey, come try this. Come see what do you see what I mean? It's the opposite. Like, we all know that many of us know how to deflect a toddler from doing something bad, because saying no just usually doesn't work. You can deflect, you can redirect, right? So I think there's so much about like redirecting young people and particularly get them when they're younger to redirect activities, but that they see it not as a class thing, but they see it as what their community is offering to them. And we've become so polarized. I mean, rural communities are suffering greatly from lack of access to resources for children. And as the population ages and there's less money for schools, I lived in a rural community for 10 years and I watched it happen. And I think there's just so much we could do if we saw them as our future and saw people who were struggling with addiction as our neighbors.
Yeah.
And in that way.
Yeah. And you were talking about the 3 different treatment ideas and combining them, and it was making me think that I had read somewhere that initially programs like AA seem to, and the treatment centers have a high success rate, but if you follow farther out, they really have a high recidivism rate. And so it
They
seems
do.
like that
They do.
there's like something that we're missing. Like we can treat them in the short term, but we don't seem to be making the changes necessary. And I know from myself and my own experiences, sometimes life gets really, really hard and you don't have money to do the things you'd like to do. You're so busy struggling. You're so exhausted from working so much. The
Yeah.
idea that, oh, they're just sitting around collecting welfare and doing drugs is like not
Yeah,
true.
that's not true. Yeah.
And a lot of people
true.
are actually working, but there's like nothing left. So they come home and they
Yeah.
drink or
Right.
do
Right.
drugs to stop
Right.
feeling the pain of
Right.
everything.
So you can see the way that, community and care then can get pulled into a moral issue where if you're not from a good family or you're getting in trouble. I mean, the experience that I had of being the mother of a child who was excelling in everything and then suddenly the child who was getting in trouble all the time, I became instantly isolated as a parent. And the isolation in my own community made me feel even worse and made me not want to be around. So that kind of hiding is what happens. And it's really easy to judge a single mom, like I was for a while. Oh, what, she cannot control her daughter, right? Like, those people, you've heard people talk about those people.
Mhm.
So I guess, what, in a really kind of simplistic way, I'm talking about like being more loving and being more neighborly at all these junctures. And that, to get back to your point about the Minnesota model and AA, those work really well for some people. There are people who really benefit from that structure, from that community, it's very powerful, and it was revolutionary when it happened. But as drug use became more extreme, and certain drugs like opioids, the way they affect your mind, and methamphetamine, the way that the cravings for it. My former son-in-law was on methadone for 5 years and did really, really well for 5 years. But he told me, I never lost my craving for meth. He said that was the hardest part. So we got to work on the researchers and the people who are doing like the brain science to say, what can we do? How can we help people? Because to continuously say, just go back to treatment. I mean, I interviewed people in this book whose children were in treatment, and adult children, they became adults, obviously, 10, 11, 14, 15 times. Now, what medical treatment would we allow to continue with a failure rate that high? Right? We just wouldn't. Wouldn't. So,
and there's things like, a lot of people who are recovering alcoholics will talk about going out and they'll say, no, I'm just going to have a soda or something. And people are like, oh, why aren't you drinking? Why have a drink? Have a drink. Question like nobody questions, oh, you're having a drink. Do you need a drink? Why are you drinking? What's wrong?
Right.
It's like, why aren't you drinking? It's like, shut up. Someone says no.
Right. Just leave them alone. Right. Well, and the what I would like to say, and this is a little off topic, but the mocktails movement of drinks that don't have alcohol in them at restaurants is really awesome.
Yeah.
It's really fantastic. We don't all want soda, right?
Right.
We don't, or soda water, right? Yeah. Were there other questions from any of you?
This is only, let's see. Yeah, I was, like sort of just yeah, like even like with people that even like with food addictions too and stuff too, it's like with sugar and everything, like I have that problem where I'll be okay and then you'll have something and then the next thing you know it's like out of control, and I'm sure it's
Right.
much worse with drugs, and it just seems like we're so busy believing in this individuality, like oh, rugged individualism, oh, you're totally in control, you just don't have willpower, you just need to decide to do it, you just need to make the choice, and you're like, if it were that easy, why wouldn't everybody choose to make the choice? So I think the biggest thing is trying to relook at how we see ourselves in the world, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, all these things are interconnected, all the issues we're having around race, class, and gender, all these issues we're having with economics, with the war on drugs, with all the issues of overdoses and substance abuse, and the rise suddenly after years of going down, violent crime is back on the rise now.
Right.
It feels
it all
like,
kind of mixes together, doesn't it, at some point?
yeah. And if we're so busy trying to do one thing at a time and not recognize the interconnectedness of it all, because in rural communities, it seems the drug issues came up as the economics and the opportunities went down. And the same thing can be said in urban inner city areas, because I lived in Chicago for a while, and there are pockets of just
I think,
poverty.
Yeah. Lena, or is it Lina?
Lina. Well,
Lina.
I realize that I've probably spent most of my life saying, hey, come try this. And I think that's something that we want to encourage people to do, find other things to do. I used to think growing up, that the end of your life should not be how many times you get drunk and throw up in the back of your pickup truck. There should be other things to do, and lots of times they're not in a community, or they're not recognized in a community, and so I've tried to do that, and I think I've contributed, and I think a lot of people are. Maybe we need to hold them up and encourage that even more.
Yeah, and I think it's
that whole vicious circle.
Yes, it is. And the idea of, inpatient treatment and making a kind of put a time out in a person's life is really powerful. It's just, what do you have to go back to, and what are the resources that you're going to have? So no, I think there's so many people doing so many good things, and like yourself, and that is one of the things that is truly, I think, really stands out in my book more than any kind of trauma and tragedy, is that even people who've lost their children are going and doing things so that other people won't. And it's that spirit of, loving kindness and care for others that is a very, very healing. It's just, we have these other layers of things that prevent everyone from having access to that.
Yeah, but I think
I do. Oh yeah, go
ahead. We need to teach people before it gets critical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's what I was trying to write, but I didn't have enough time to write it all out. Is that you teach that way of thinking before it gets critical. I mean, sure, once it gets critical, then you have to do something about it.
Of course.
You really have to do something about it before it gets critical.
I've learned a lot from the students in my drugs and addiction and recovery class about, when they come in and we talk about, like, okay, well, where are you in this situation? Like, do you have personal experience? And people will, say, my parents, told me don't touch alcohol because I'm really like, because of this or that. And then others, and then what they learn in my class is the history of these actual substances and how the impact they have on bodies. We do a whole thing about like, what does this cause? What does this cause?
Yeah.
And they're so angry. They love getting the information, but they're like, why didn't they tell us this in high school? Why didn't anybody tell me this before college, right? So I think we're really cheating young people by our fear. And that goes with abstinence only education, and it goes with just say no drug education. If we showed them what actually happened and that there are plenty of things that are not good, they would get it. They would get it. It's just that we don't trust teenagers.
Yeah, we think they're going to get ideas if
they're going to get ideas. They're susceptible. And yes, of course, we're all susceptible. I mean, how many times have I downloaded a dieting app or a new, an app on how to do more exercise? It's like we all have a little bit of that. I do have something I could read very briefly.
Okay.
Great.
Yes, please.
Does that sound good? Okay, so this is from
Yes.
my introduction on page 13. It's kind of the end of it's just the last 2.5 pages. In 2016, when I began teaching uses and abuses, drugs, addiction, and recovery at Macalester College, a small, rigorous liberal arts college in St. Paul, I decided to change the perception of harm reduction as bad in my classroom by bringing in a local harm reduction professional, Stephanie Devich, to train my students how to use naloxone. They left class with a naloxone kit. Both Stephanie and I remained committed to the trainings, but I always wondered if any of the kits were ever used. Student EMTs who took my class soon lobbied for campus-wide access and education. 2 years later, trainings were offered to the campus community at large by enthusiastic harm reduction peer educators, the first of whom were trained by Stephanie. The health center agreed to provide kits to students and also placed them in specified emergency locations in the dorms and around campus. When the COVID-19 pandemic forced us all apart and online, I still wanted to get students naloxone trained in my class. During our first online semester, a peer trainer made a video, and I arranged for postal delivery of the kits to my students' now far-flung locations. To my great surprise, one night in mid-November of 2020, I received an email from a student living on campus who wrote, "Thought you would be interested to know that I just revived a guy on the bus with 2 vials of naloxone you gave me. It was pretty crazy. He was blue, and I just drew up the vials and gave it to him. He revived after the second dose and was up and gone before the paramedics arrived. I just wanted to say thanks for handing out the naloxone in your class." I was stunned by this news, a save. Applied humanities and civic engagement are cornerstones of my teaching philosophy, and yet the thoughtful way that my students so willingly discarded stigma and embraced harm reduction took my teaching and the mission of this book to a whole new level. It matters how we treat each other. It matters how we care for each other. All of the professionals, family members, and others I interviewed who treat, care for, and love people with substance use disorders are stellar human beings. They too want their work to matter in the lives of the people they serve. Because they often embody different approaches, the history of the push and pull between these models for addiction treatment, abstinence only versus medical interventions, emerged as one of the key conflicts of this book. How does a state that is the birthplace of rehab reckon with highly addictive and very deadly new kinds of opioids? How does the abstinence model continue to justify itself when clients leave treatment and promptly die from an opioid overdose? How can a sober house deny housing to residents who need opioid agonists to function so they can get their lives back on track? What can harm reduction practices of the HIV/AIDS era offer to this epidemic of overdose deaths? Why do medications that treat opioid use disorder, like methadone and buprenorphine, remain marginalized, stigmatized, and difficult to obtain, especially during a crisis like this one? With my own family's experience with opioid addiction lying squarely in front of me, the lives of my narrators guided me through these questions. What emerged were complex answers that highlight their experiences within a historical context. This book is not a history of the current opioid epidemic in the United States, nor a history of the war on drugs, nor does it present a thorough history of the Minnesota model, addiction medicine, or the history of research on addiction. Many talented historians and scholars have and continue to chronicle the complexity of this most human affliction. This book is about capturing the stories of people who've interacted and interfaced with the consequences of opioids in a ubiquitous drug treatment model that has only recently started to embrace medications and harm reduction services. The opioid epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the revived but long-suffering racial injustices we faced in 2020, most notably for this state, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, have all amplified the deep inequities in our country that have existed for generations now. The moment is fraught with difficulty and calls for the kind of reckoning this book aspires to. Do not despair, though. There are plenty of redemptive and empowering stories on these pages. Doing this work has taught me much about our ability to survive traumas of all kinds. The will to live, improve, recover, and innovate is as human as all of our other struggles, failures, and weaknesses. How's that?
Very nice.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was really fascinating, and I look forward to getting to finish your book.
You're welcome. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to put or any thoughts later after you read it. I will, there's my email.
All right. Let me write that down.
I noticed too that your county has not suffered too badly by this epidemic. It's still tough though. It's so interesting to look county by county. Let me see. I have one more link to share with you. If you don't know about this, maybe you could stick it somewhere on the website too. It's the Minnesota, oh, that's the CDC, sorry. The Minnesota Opioid Dashboard, here we go. This is where you can look county by county. This last one here. If you want to see a visual of how bad this is getting, the Minnesota Department of Public Health does this for us.
Wow.
It's really important, and we do really good work here in Minnesota. We're really, really lucky. There's a lot of states that are not doing what we're doing to take care of people. So I just want to end on that note, that I'm really proud that Minnesota is my home, and I'm really proud and amazed by all the people doing the kind of work here that they're doing to help other people. So.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what you do, and thank you for educating young people, because I feel like you're right. They're too little is, it's
too
not
little is shared with them. Yep.
Yes. And so that's really great. Well,
yeah.
thank you very much. And hopefully if we ever get a chance to have authors come up to Wadena sort of reunion for everybody to meet and greet and get their book signed, we'd be able to meet you. Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you,
Bye,
Lorna.
everybody.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Okay.